brought together Eastern Galicia and Bohemia. So however, they also were not pro-Russian, right? So when Germany invaded, a lot of these Ukrainians who had just joined Ukraine, but part of like the Soviet sphere in 1939, viewed the Germans as liberators. And they started, the OUN formed an insurgent army, and they started to work with the Nazis. And so the idea with the Ukrainian nationalist movement, because, there's a lot of, whenever you hear, like, for instance, Chrystia Freeland recently held up the blood and soil flag, right, of the OUN,
right,
which is a Nazi organization. And, I was reading the National Post version of it because, of course, she claims that this is Russian disinfo, that this grouping is even a controversial thing to be holding. And, she's Ukrainian as well. This is our Deputy Prime Minister of Canada. I think people who weren't aware of her became aware of her after the trucker protest and her heavy-handedness. And the OUN, this nationalist movement, this very, sympathetic nationalist movement, viewed that they wanted a pure Ukraine race, okay? So they started to do genocide on the Jewish Poles, but also ethnic Poles and ethnic Russians, because they wanted a pure race. So that is at the very core of the Ukrainian nationalist movement from the OUN, which is where, it originated.
Right.
So they started to work with the Nazis later. Yeah, so when the OUN started to work, they recruited 80,000 volunteers in 1.5 months, the SS Galician, and they were notorious for their extreme cruelty. So, you hear the horror stories of what the Nazis did to people in terms of human experimentation and just, outright torture and mutilation. You hear about the Japanese Unit 731. The SS Galician also were on that level. Horrific crimes against humanity that they did. And basically, what did I want to say? Stephen Bandera was a leader of the OUN, and he was born in Galicia. This is going to be important for people to keep in mind as we, come closer to more recent events in Ukraine. Mykola Lebed is also a part of the OUN, they were both implicated in this genocide that was occurring, that was at its peak between 1943 and 1944. They did eventually start to fight the Nazis, and this is used as an excuse for why they're not so bad. But if you just look at their crimes and their view of like what a pure ethnic, Ukraine race is, it's problematic. So after World War II ended, the OUN kept fighting the USSR until the mid-1950s. Mykola Lebed, who's one of the leaders of this genocide, he was given safe haven by the CIA and Stephen Bandera. And, Reinhard Gehlen, who's a part of the, he was the head torturer of Russian prisoners, but also, I would imagine, American prisoners. He was also put back into West Germany after World War II, a Nazi, right? Like a high-level Nazi. And he was put in charge of the surveillance of West Germany after World War II. And this was all done by Alan Dulles. And like Mykola Lebed, also Stephen Bandera was also put back into West Germany. And Operation Gladio, a lot of people try to act like this is with everything.
I know.
They just act like it's a conspiracy theory. The Italian, I don't know if it's prime minister or president in the early 1990s, he exposed it. He said that this is a real problem. And for those who don't know, Operation Gladio was that after World War II, the fascists, the Nazis became the new allies, and the Russians became the new enemies. Communism, right? Soviet communism. And so it was considered justified to hire these criminals, like psychopaths, to not only create problems for Soviet communism in countries throughout the world, not just Italy, but they were responsible for terrorist acts against the civilians of these countries. They weren't necessarily communist, right? And the whole point of it, there's a really good documentary BBC did of Operation Gladio you can find on YouTube. But the reason why they were hired to also commit terrorist acts was to give the state more power so that they could have more heavy-handedness with however they wanted to deal with things. And, you know, since the late 1990s, 1998, there was the biggest declassification of Nazi war crime records that was released by Congress. There was another wave in 2005 and I think 2010. And it has shown that US intelligence kept strong ties with these Ukrainian Nazi nationalists since 1946 to today. And you see it with Chrystia Freeland, you see it with Victoria Nuland, and I'll talk about Victoria Nuland later on.
Great.
So these operations, Alan Dulles, for people who are not aware, he was the one that orchestrated much of this. And NATO is also directly implicated in Operation Gladio. MI6, they're all guilty.
Is Operation Gladio what people call false flag events? Is that related to that?
No, it was called, it was the stay behinds that usually that's what you hear referenced to.
Oh, okay.
But,
I see.
Yeah. And Alan Dulles, for people who are not aware, was the director of the CIA for, I think, something like 12 years, you know, from the early 50s on. And he was only removed as the director of CIA by President Kennedy for his treason.
And he didn't like that at all.
No. Yeah, well, look what happened.
I know.
And so by fast forwarding, so Ukraine, just for people to also know, so after World War II, Ukraine became a part of the Soviet sphere.
Right.
And their industry actually became very strong, such that Ukraine, by the end of the USSR, you know, sphere of influence with Ukraine, they were the richest country in Eastern Europe. Okay, so when the Soviet Union was dissolved in 1991, Ukraine became independent really for the first time in its entire history. However, you know, it just was